Well, I've been in China for the whole pandemic, so my source of information is while speaking to my family in Montreal and friends in Canada and US and Europe through email, and just reading the Western newspapers and media. And my impression is that there's not that much reporting on the relative success of dealing with the pandemic in China. I think it's some sort of, on the one hand, it's a general prejudice against the political system here. On the other hand, it's also because China is viewed as the source of the original epidemic. So, no matter what China does, it will be kind of blamed for the disease in some sense. There's a view that China poses a major threat to the US's role as the dominant power in the world. No matter who's president, whether it's Donald Trump or maybe Joe Biden after the election, I don't expect that view is going to go away, and that there's going to be strong resistance for cooperation with China on high technology that could have potential security applications. But of course, because of this election, there's this very extreme demonization of China for two reasons. One is to just deflect attention from their own failures in dealing with the pandemic, and two, that it's easier to get votes if you if you have a clear enemy in people's minds, and you promise, as President Trump would say, I'm the guy who can deal with this enemy in an effective way. It's also one way of scaremongering people and getting people to vote for him. If they had dealt in an efficient way with this disease, maybe then they wouldn't have to do that. But it was a dramatic failure in dealing with this pandemic, and President Trump doesn't look like somebody who's going to search in his soul to find his fault and then blame himself, right? We discuss this in our book for two different kinds of hierarchies that are relevant here. One is respect for conscientious professionals, or junzi, to use this kind of Confucian language. While sometimes when you have like Dr. Zhongnan Shan on January 20th, when he announced that it was possibility of human-to-human transmission, the whole country listened to him. And then when the lockdown on Hubei was announced on January 23rd, there wasn't that much kind of dissent, even at the popular level, because people understood that it was important. Of course, there's also this tradition of respect for conscientious professionals who are critics and who see something wrong, and out of good-heartedness try to publicize that. But the other kind of respect for hierarchy that may be lacking in Western countries, especially the United States, which has a very strong anti-elitist tradition, fanjingzhuyi in Chinese, is this idea that when it comes to dealing with urgent situations, whether it's a war or a flood or a pandemic, sometimes you need a very strong state that's going to take harsh measures, and those measures are in the interests of the people. But of course, they're harsh measures that are meant to be only in the short term. Once the measures are successful, then we can resume our everyday life without a very strong state watching over us. That view, I think it's widely shared in China, but this respect for, let's call it hierarchically organized state that takes strong measures for emergencies, that tradition is pretty much absent in the United States. There's great respect for Fauci among educated people and among scientific experts, but there's still a very strong, let's call it anti-elitist or anti-intellectual tradition in the US, where people just don't listen to him. And that's, I don't know what percentage, but it's a very significant percentage, which affects the likelihood of success in dealing with the pandemics. So people blame the United States administration, President Trump, for being ineffective, and that's true. Certainly they didn't deal with this in a efficient, timely, and scientifically informed way. But there's also this kind of culture of just anti-state and anti-elitism, which makes it very difficult to deal with these urgent situations anyway, no matter who would be president. They don't have this tradition of respect for a strong state that's going to take strong measures to deal with emergencies as a short term. And they don't have a very unified political system. Even if the president was totally rational and well-informed by science and said things that were true, it would still be hard to deal with this pandemic in an efficient way, because there's so many different levels of government that could provide different views and counter the president, not to mention his strong culture of anti-elitism that would make it much more difficult. Look at the origins of the United States, right? It was founded as a kind of rebellion, kind of populist rebellion against a monarchy in the UK, which kind of was viewed as oppressive and not giving people in the United States colony a chance to express their views, and they were forced to pay taxes without having representation. So even though the leaders of the rebellion were these great intellectuals, Thomas Jefferson and so on, but there was also a very strong element of populism. And those who had more of a tradition of respect for authority and concern for harmonious society, they were loyalists who fled to Canada. So Canada has a different political culture, not very anti-elitism, in part because of these differences with the United States at its very origin, were those who, having some sort of love of a monarch who would act in the interests of the people, and who have a strong respect for harmonious society and don't take great pride in rebellion or using guns to defend their interests. Those people fled to Canada, right? So that's one reason why Canada has a much more harmonious society and less of this anti-elitist tradition, I think. I mean, I'm from Montreal, and you probably know Montreal in Canada was the hardest hit city in Canada, and it's not because of bad government. I mean, the mayor of Montreal, her name is Valérie Plante, she's very well informed, very sensitive, took good measures, but it all started much too late. One reason is just Montreal people are kind of creative and often it's a beautiful city and wonderful art scene, but often, to use Chinese, 不听话, they're not good at listening to authority figures, even when the authority figures are rational and say good things in their interest. So it's not just the government. I mean, even if you have a relatively good, decent form of government, not corrupt, acts in the people's interests, doesn't lie, Montreal and the rest of Canada has free healthcare, basically. So that's not, lack of access to decent healthcare wasn't a big issue, but still things became bad in Montreal. But to the general question of why Montreal has a stronger, more robust welfare system, I mean, one is this tradition. There's this less of a kind of libertarian, anti-elitist, anti-strong state tradition, which you have in the United States. It comes from the origins. To be frank, Canada benefits a little bit from the US security umbrella. I mean, the US spends so much on the military, and there's an implicit trade-off that they'll protect Canada in cases of crisis. So Canada doesn't have to spend that much on the military. They could spend more on the welfare. So in that sense, even Canadians wouldn't recognize that, but there has to be a little bit of element of being grateful to the United States for providing the security umbrella. I'm not an expert on the United States, but it does seem obvious that many of the poor sectors of society lack access to decent health care and lead unhealthy lives, eating lots of fast food. Maybe it's cheaper, and have high rates of diabetes and obesity, and also engage in dirty and dangerous work that makes them weaker and that exposes them to diseases. For example, working in meat packing plants under tight and unhygienic conditions. And it tends to be, and the minority groups, especially African Americans, have a higher proportion of people who under those conditions. So they're much more affected in a negative way by this pandemic than other groups. Because of this huge gap between rich and poor in the United States, and with poor people lacking access to decent welfare and decent health care, they're much more the poor are much more vulnerable to this sort of pandemic than other sectors of society. The West is quite diverse. I mean, the US in its constitution prioritizes civil and political rights over social and economic rights. And that's important. But other countries in the West, for example, Nordic countries or even Canada, would say that it's very important for the state to provide basic material welfare for its citizens. But I'm not sure it's really about differences in human rights. It's really that on the one hand, there's a strong anti-elitist tradition. On the other hand, there's a strong concern for privacy and individual autonomy, which of course we have it in China as well, but maybe not as strong. And also in China, people would say in short term we can sacrifice our privacy and individual autonomy in order to deal with this urgent health crisis, whereas in the US and even Canada, to be frank, there's more resistance to those measures. Or even this idea of using the latest high technology to monitor people who have the disease and who they came in contact with. I mean, that's not just in China. I mean, in South Korea it was used quite successfully, and it included dramatic curtailments of privacy. And those sorts of measures, I think there'd be much greater resistance to them in the US and even in Canada because of this kind of prioritization of privacy. South Korea is viewed as an ally, as a kind of basically as a liberal democracy, so they can overlook. I mean, actually, if you look at the way that South Korea dealt with this pandemic, compared to Shanghai, it's not that different. I mean, Shanghai wasn't under severe lockdown like in Hubei, right? But for some reason, the Western media doesn't think that, because I think Shanghai is part of this, totalitarian state that's going to invade people's privacy and not doing it in the interest of the people but in the interest of the rulers, whereas South Korea somehow the rulers are kind of good and well-intentioned and okay, they do a bit of overlooking people's privacy, but we're not going to make a big deal out of it. The point is that there might be very strong measures to deal with urgent situations in the short term that curtail people's privacy, but that's not meant to be permanent, and it's not meant to deprive people of simple joys of ordinary life with family members or traveling abroad, or these are not meant to be permanent measures enacted by a totalitarian state that acts against people's interests, right?